welcome to this evening's Ideas Exchange. When the
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Fleishman, foreign editor for the Los Angeles Times. Thank you all for tuning in to Ideas Exchange, the LA Times series where we invite some of the best creative thinkers and thought leaders to join us for a conversation about their work. Our guest tonight is award-winning journalist and author Masha Gessen. They are the author of 12 books, including the National Book Award-winning The Future is History. Masha are here tonight to discuss their newest book, Surviving Autocracy. You can order a copy of Surviving Autocracy with a signed book plate from our partner and one of LA's favorite independent bookstores, Skylight Books. And now let's get to the conversation with Masha. Welcome.
Hi, Jeffrey. Good to be here. It's actually 11 books. Just, I'm not going to get ahead of myself.
Okay. As you did so well in this book, describing the times, I find, as we're writers and editors, it's just, it almost defies description. You look for metaphor or all kinds of things to put these moments into perspective. And how would you say, with the virus, the protests, and other things that have really buffeted our times, what will be the short-term and lasting impact, do you think, on what we're looking at today?
I don't think that we should be in the business of making those kinds of predictions. I mean, it's hard. It's incredibly tempting, and of course, that's part of what people look to us for is a kind of fortune telling. But I think there's a fine difference between sort of trying to register and describe what's out there right now and talking about what the impact will be. I mean, we don't know. Right? I think we're witnessing extraordinary times. I can talk about the dangers and opportunities inherent in these times, but I really don't know what's going to happen, and I'm not going to pretend to know. So briefly, some dangers of the time. I think that we're the pandemic in particular, which I almost just caught myself speaking about in the past tense, which is, of course, what we've started doing in the media. Kind of, there was a period that was marked by the coronavirus, coronavirus everywhere all the time, and now that media moment has passed, in large part through the sort of the theatrics of the White House, which have put it behind us. We no longer see the White House press briefings. We no longer see Dr. Fauci. We no longer see Dr. Birx. We're no longer riveted to COVID updates. So it is as though, as a spectacle, if not as an experience, it is behind us, right? But anyway, the dangers of the coronavirus period, I think, are that we have been isolated. We have seen the death of politics, right? Both, sort of organized politics, such as school board meetings and town council meetings, and the political conversations that we have casually in our everyday lives, right? What the comings, the many different kinds of coming together that disappeared with the lockdown, and that are coming back in some very distorted ways and also in some very dangerous ways, right? So in a sense, for the 2 months of lockdown, what we saw was almost, but for a very different set of reasons, almost a textbook authoritarian state. What is an authoritarian state? An authoritarian state is a state where one leader or a group of leaders make decisions while everyone else goes home and tends to their private lives, right? And in an authoritarian state, nothing is political, which is what's different about authoritarianism from totalitarianism. In totalitarianism, everything is political. Under authoritarianism, nothing is political. And so for a very different set of reasons, we saw almost a perfect model of authoritarianism, right? A group of men making decisions with very few checks on them, very sort of demonstratively, and the rest of us literally tending only to our private lives, right? And we also experienced practically terror, right? Not state terror, but the kind of terror that creates extreme anxiety and that tends to benefit autocratic rule. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we are looking at protests, and I think that protests are not mere protests, right? The sustained, ongoing protests all over the country, and in fact, all over the world, are really an extraordinary event. And I think it's not an overstatement to call them a revolutionary moment. Now, part of the reason I use that phrasing is because we're actually seeing certain radical ideas or ideas that were marked as radical just a few weeks ago, literally 2 weeks ago, start becoming subjects of legitimate debate, becoming subjects of mainstream debate, and being very, very quickly assimilated into kind of mainstream political thinking, right? So ideas of defunding the police, abolishing the police, of entirely reconceiving law and order, of challenging the carceral state, all of these things that were very, very esoteric political ideas are suddenly becoming quite mainstream. And that may actually call forward a discussion of, what is politics? Why we get together in politics? Why we pool our resources by paying taxes? What is that for? Is it to arm a bunch of men so that they can mete out punishment and discipline, or is it for another reason? Is it to make us happier, to make to create solidarity, to create mutual aid, to educate our children, to take care of one another? That might be another reason why we're getting together and pooling our resources. So there's an actual opportunity for a fundamental shift in political thinking for the entire country. But which is going to win out this autocratic attempt on the part of Donald Trump, which for its own set of reasons can gain strength, or this incredible revolutionary movement? I have no idea.
It comes down to momentum and sustainability of what's happening now, correct?
I think it comes down in part to that. It comes down to all sorts of things that look, if ever there was a year when nobody should make any predictions, this is the year. There was, I don't know if you saw, there was a very funny comedy sketch making the rounds a couple of months ago, a woman talking to her 4 months ago self. And the 4 months ago self was convinced that the Australian wildfires were going to be the defining moment of 2020. So I am not going to stand here and pretend to think that I know what the defining moment or defining circumstances of 2020 are going to be. This year is going to defy everything.
You say in your book that Trumpian news has a way of being shocking without being surprising. And it seems that like the frog in water, as some people, boiling water, as some people would say, we've become inured to it, so that it's not shocking anymore, and it's I don't know if it's numbing, but it's a language, you also say, of the mafia state. How has that so changed the political discourse?
I think there are a bunch of things going on, and I don't want to come across as sounding like we're somehow deficient in sort of normalizing what has in fact become our normal existence. Right? This president has been president for 3.5 years. This rhythm of news, this style of news, these kinds of events have become, in a sense, unsurprising. Right? So these circumstances of every week having a series of revelations or events or Trump statements that are shocking without being surprising, this pattern is established. And it would be strange if we reacted to it as freshly as perhaps we want to, right? I mean, the outrage cannot be as immediate and as fresh as it was 3 years ago, because we do have memory and we do form certain kinds of expectations. So I think we in the media have a duty to resist normalizing certain things, but that job is incredibly difficult because, and I write in the book about the trap of the Trumpian tweet, for example, or more broadly, Trump's statements, because he does some very complicated, in very simple ways, he performs some very complicated tricks. Like, for example, he uses words and phrases and assertions to mean nothing, as in he says things that are entirely nonsensical. Like, for example, today he talked about the great scientist who developed an AIDS vaccine. Now, as we know, there is no AIDS vaccine, and while there are certainly great scientists, none of them have developed it. That ridiculous statement will probably, this is a prediction, will probably, like some of Trump's other ridiculous statements, be walked back as a joke or as hyperbole. So we will witness the president himself saying that what he said wasn't really intended to mean anything. But of course, everything he says actually means things. Last time we heard him walk something back and say that he was actually joking was when he suggested that people should be ingesting chlorine to cleanse their bodies of coronavirus. And then he said he was kidding, but by that point, poison centers around the country were overwhelmed with calls from people who had either done it or were considering doing it. His words had real consequences because he has a bullet pulpit, because he has the biggest microphone in the country, because he insists on having the biggest microphone in the country, and he insists on his bully right to say whatever he wants whenever he wants to. So even when he says things that mean nothing, they actually mean something. And that is a real dilemma. That is a very complicated thing to describe, and to describe continuously in every Trump story.
Where you discuss the media a lot in the book, the mainstream media and coverage. Where is the mainstream media failing in covering this administration and articulating exactly what is going on?
Well, let me give you an example of something that I think is actually very successful, which is it's sort of tangential to mainstream media in the sense that it's not part of a giant institution, and I think that's important. My absolute favorite media in the time of Trump is the podcast Trump Inc., which is produced by WNYC, the New York public radio station, and ProPublica. And it's I think they come out bi-weekly. It's about half an hour, and they frame it as an open investigation. So they have questions and that they ask continuously. They do a lot of crowdsourcing. Their reporting is transparent, and they work on kind of describing this this phenomenon of Trumpism in particular through looking at corruption, right? So money, largely real estate, Trump, the Trump organization's dealings, and I think where they are incredibly successful is in keeping the story open-ended on the one hand, and on the other hand, putting enough distance between themselves and the story, and never letting you forget that they're trying to describe Trumpism as a system. They don't have all the information, but all the clues that they're finding are clues to something that we haven't seen before in this particular form, and they're trying to describe it. That actually is a very unusual approach for media, and it requires a lot of agility on the part of these podcasters. And so I think it's no accident that it's a small team in fairly small organizations, right? This public radio station and ProPublica. I think it's much harder for a large institution with a lot of institutional memory, such as, say, the New York Times, which I pick on a lot in the book. And I pick on it because it has some really egregious examples of, I think, journalistic mistakes, but also because it's, in some ways, it sets the tone for how we journalists deal with Trumpism. And I think that the problems that the New York Times faces as an institution are real, right? It's a very big ship. It's very difficult to change course. Or to mix my metaphors, there are certain pillars that the New York Times rests on. And you can't just demolish them without sort of putting something in their place. And these pillars are the objective style, which is a tone of extreme restraint, which is the style of writing stories as pro and con arguments, the two sides to every story kind of approach to reporting, which I don't think is terribly productive, but it is a huge part of that institution. And it gives us stories like Trump says testing no longer a problem, governors disagree, which really, as my friend epidemiologist and inveterate Twitterer Greg Gonzalez pointed out, is just one step short of saying Trump says Earth flat. Scientists disagree. It creates the illusion of the possibility of arguing about facts. It places a lie and factual, knowable reality on the same scale and creates an equivalency between them. And those are the ways in which we sort of habitually go wrong, and those are the ways in which we normalize Trump.
Speaking of institutions, I was in Europe during the Bush-Gore election fiasco, and one thing Europeans would always say is that you benefit from being an American because if your personalities are weaker, the corruption, your institutions will come in and eventually save the day. But now it seems that our institutions are under attack and diminishing in the eyes of the public and what they stand for.
I think Americans, a third of the book is about that. A third of the book is about how institutions have not and will not save us. And Americans have this extraordinary faith in institutions. And I use the word faith intentionally. It's kind of a religious, it's a civic religion. Americans think that the founding fathers created such a perfect system that all we have to do to sort of stay on course is maintain those institutions and rely on them. I think it's, in some ways it's naive and silly. Nothing that was designed 250 years ago is a perfect system. Nothing's a self-repairing system. But it also ignores some really important things. One is that institutions do not exist in a vacuum. Institutions are fueled and enabled and challenged by the society that they exist in. And a very good example of that is what happened with the travel bans. We saw a robust reaction from the courts to the first Trump travel ban, which came out a week after the inauguration. And immediately, a number of federal courts issued injunctions against it. And part of the reason it was so fast and so definitive was because there were so many protests and so many lawsuits, and sort of all of civil society placed the right kind of pressure on the courts to both enable them and urge them to act. And then the protests kind of died down, and public attention to the issue kind of fizzled as Trump went on with travel ban 2.0 and then travel ban 3.0. But there was also something else going on, which is that Trump was acting in relationship to the judicial system in a way that no other president has ever really acted. Right? He started denigrating the judicial system. He was tweeting all sorts of insults about judges, and he also introduced travel bans 2.0 and 3.0, which are very, they're like the way that a New York real estate developer will approach City Hall when his application for a variance is turned down. He'll go to talk to somebody. He'll maybe see if there's a way around this. He'll maybe call the back alley, a street to get around the air and light requirements, and he'll get this thing done because he views regulations, he views laws as obstacles to be overcome. We're not used to presidents who view the judicial system as an obstacle to be overcome. We're used to presidents who accept it as part of the system of checks and balances on their power, and who, when an executive order is deemed unconstitutional, will step back. They may think it's unfair, they may think it's wrong, but they will step back. That's the compact. And Trump is oblivious or resentful of this compact. And our institutions are not designed for that. They cannot withstand a bad faith actor. Is it possible to create an institution that would actually withstand a bad faith actor? I don't think so. I don't think that's actually like a solvable problem. I think that political institutions, by definition, depend on the good faith of everybody who's participating.
Hence his fascination, and you spend time in the book with this too, on Putin and Kim Jong-un and Viktor Orban and MBS in Saudi Arabia. I mean, he senses a brotherhood with them, or a sense of that this is how you run a government, and everything is the gravity toward me.
Absolutely, I think that he thinks that that's what power looks like. And we've been obsessed with his relationship with Putin, whatever it is. But there's not a whole lot to justify being obsessed with his relationship with Putin over his relationship or the way he relates to any other autocrat that comes across his screen. Right? He has an unerring nose for them, and he has unfailing admiration for what he calls their ability to control a country, right? He said that about Kim Jong-un, he said that about Putin, look at the way that guy controls things. He expressed admiration for Duterte and his so-called war on drugs, which was basically a system of inciting and delegating violence, extrajudicial violence in the Philippines. He was immediately drawn to Bolsonaro. He has given Benjamin Netanyahu more than Netanyahu has asked for. So he just loves these guys. He wants to be a member of their club. He recognizes them as his own kind.
Mm-hmm. In the book, also sticking with Russia for a bit and the Russia investigation, you explore that. I think there's the heading on the one chapter is Mueller did not save us, and so many people had so many hopes that was going to happen, that some type of institutional justice or exploration was going to set things right, and the truth was going to come out, and things would be revealed. Where did Mueller do well, and where did he fail us as far as public perception goes about airing all what had happened?
Where do I start? I mean, to start with, the extreme obsession with the Russia investigation was, I think, a bit of magical thinking. Because if you thought it through at any moment, you kind of couldn't game it out to the end of the Trump presidency, right? There was nothing that Mueller could have possibly come back with that had to do with Russia, right? That would have, for example, as I think people sort of subconsciously hoped, that would have invalidated the results of the 2016 election. That wasn't going to happen. But I think there was this irrational hope that he was going to do it. I think there was also a lot of sort of cathecting onto Mueller was really disturbing to me. I mean, Mueller he ran the FBI for a record 13 years. He ran the FBI after 9/11. He turned a domestic police institution into a spy agency. He, he turned it into an agency that tortured people. Mueller is not a guy that that deserved a whole lot of our trust. Mueller
You mentioned the press had a love affair with him to an extent.
And the press had an absolute love affair with him, with everything from his restraint to his Brooks Brothers suits. I found it incredibly unsettling and creepy. But
why did the press go that way, do you think, given that they knew his history at the FBI?
I think the press are very forgetful in some ways. And I also think that there's, nostalgia is an incredibly powerful political force. Nostalgia is a large part of the reason that we have Trump in office. Nostalgia is always a longing to go to a past that never existed. Right? So in this imaginary past, if Trump promises, an imaginary past of white supremacy and economic security, the imaginary past that Mueller symbolized was this past of institutions working as they were intended to, and civility and law and order in the best possible imaginable sense of the word, and not in the sense of the words that Trump uses them. So I think it was this nostalgia for normality, and somehow Mueller in his Brooks Brothers suits and his $35 watch managed to personify this dream of a normality lost. And the Russia report, the first half of the Russia report that actually dealt with Russia, produced, I think it's an incredibly interesting document, but it didn't give people what they subconsciously dreamed of, which was something, which was a reason to say, okay, Americans didn't elect Trump. He came from outer space, and now he's going to magically disappear into outer space. The second part of the Mueller report, which I think is a much more important document, which documents obstruction of justice, and which actually gives the most detailed portrait of the Trump presidency that we have at this point. That's where impeachment proceedings should have started. And they didn't. And I think that Trump, Mueller, in his reserved way, suggested that Congress should take the ball from there. Congress, in its very political way, and the sort of the calculus of are we going to have enough votes, did not initiate impeachment proceedings. And then we had that moment of Mueller testifying in Congress where his restraint, all of that wanted civility just kind of came across as nothing, right? As recalcitrance, as an absence. And the very next day, an emboldened Trump has a conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky.
One of my favorite phrases in your book is word piles. We have Trump, the administration has given us alternative facts and fake news, but you've given us word piles. What are some of your favorite word piles? And as you went through and were doing research on the book.
Well, the thing about word piles is that they're very difficult to memorize because they're entirely nonsensical. It's just like it's this barrage that comes out of his mouth. So I can't actually produce one on cue, but probably one of the most memorable was his 100-day in office interview to the Associated Press, when he went on about firing missiles at Syria, and somehow, like, everything he said, when it came out of his mouth, lost meaning. Right? It was. The reason that I use the term word pile is that I offer a kind of taxonomy of Trump's use of language, and I think that he has a few distinct ways of damaging language, and one of them is to use words to mean their opposite, and then the other one is to use words to mean nothing, and it just fills the air. It fills the information space with static. It's like we're constantly walking through haze, like in a very polluted city where you can't really see, right? Because the air is so thick with particles, and every so often something comes into focus, and then immediately it becomes hazy again. I think that's kind of the experience of living as a news consumer during the Trump presidency.
He's on his way to the president is on his way to Tulsa, Oklahoma this weekend. He was going to give a rally on Friday, but that was Juneteenth Day, and he took a lot of criticism and pulled back, and the date was moved. So he's confronting two things there. The scientists and doctors are saying that this is going to be another petri dish for the virus, and then he's also going to confront questions of race, both outside and inside. It's again another provocation, but this time, as with the coronavirus when it started too, he's provoking, at least when it comes to the coronavirus, something he can't control, and that's, I think, is what's been happening with his presidency since then. There's something out there that he can't wrestle in or tweet and bring any substance to.
I don't know that that's entirely true. I mean, sort of on the facts of it, of course, he can't tell the virus what to do. So in that sense, he can't control it. But think about the extent to which he has been able to control the way we relate to this pandemic. I mean, that's where our conversation started, was that I caught myself about to refer to the pandemic in the past tense. I know, and you know, and everybody in the audience, I hope, knows that this pandemic is probably in its early stages. We know this because we can read and we can think, and we're somewhat familiar with the science. And yet our experience of it is that it happened, and maybe there will be a first wave, but all of us on some level hope that maybe there won't be. And anyway, somehow it's in the past. And even my state of New York, or the state where my father lives, Massachusetts, those states are reopening. They're reopening the economies in ways that are clearly not advisable, right? It's premature. We're not ready for them. We're not ready. The papers that were coming out, even of the White House back in April, that said, for example, that we need to have massive testing in order to be able to even consider reopening. We're not up to those standards, and yet we're all reopening. And so that's actually testimony to the extent to which Donald Trump has been able to control our experience of living through this pandemic, despite obviously not being able to control the virus or even understand very much about the virus.
But do you think the numbers are beginning to seep in? I understand the point about we are reopening and people are out without masks, but it seems like the gradual accumulation is beginning to take hold of where we are. Or do you think not?
I don't know. I don't have a sense of that. I was upstate for a couple of weeks, and I just came back 2 days ago. And yesterday I went, I rode from Harlem, where I live, down to Brooklyn, and the number of people sitting outside of restaurants. Restaurants have set up outdoor spaces. People are eating and drinking there. They're not supposed to be doing that. That is, New York City has not officially reopened to that extent. The number of people, particularly, I noticed young white men without masks in Manhattan, is staggering, right? And I think I think there are a lot of ways in which we have completely failed to have a conversation about this pandemic, and individual experience, even of absorbing the numbers, or worse yet, but of course much more effectively, absorbing actual losses, but whether in people's own families or adjacent to them. That is not a substitute for having a political conversation, for having a conversation in society. And while I'm on the subject, I think that one of our big failures is that, as we usually have with American political conversations, we have had this conversation almost exclusively in terms of individual responsibility. Sometimes individual responsibility, as a kind of magnanimous gesture toward other people whom you're protecting, but still individual responsibility. In the 3.5 months that we have actively been talking about the coronavirus, we have yet to have a conversation about us as a society, setting a kind of society-wide agenda for how we deal with the pandemic.
Why haven't?
In the absence, why haven't we? I think because it's not part of American political culture, and it would take actual political leadership to shift it. I don't think we're incapable of it. I don't think Americans are too stupid to have that kind of conversation, but it actually requires, an articulation of the way that we should be thinking differently about this. And it can't come from me talking to you on this webcast or somebody else. There are lots of smart people who have written articles about this or talked about it on podcasts. That's too small. That is not a substitute for actual public politics, and we don't have that.
One of the chapters in your book deals with the power of moral authority, and you've mentioned AOC and Václav Havel and his comparison to Don Quixote for somebody holding up a mirror to society, and sometimes those people are ridiculed. What are the pressures people today face in America and around the world, really, in Europe and other places about calling out moral authority to absolute power? I mean, it's been going on for centuries, but what are the dangers? What are the pressures they're facing, and how?
Okay, I've lost sound.
Hello?
Oh, yes, now I can hear you again. What are the pressures that they're facing? And then
Yes.
second, I have no sound. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's a great question, because of course there's now this media debate. It probably feels much larger to me than it does to most people, because it's like this New York media brouhaha. But there's a big conversation going on about moral clarity, which is it's a phrase that the journalist Wesley Lowery used in reaction to the New York Times publishing an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, who was advocating the use of the military to quell unrest during the protests. And the New York Times, went into that incident with its whole kind of let's show both sides of every argument ethos, and it framed the argument as use military force, do not use military force. Well, if you frame the argument that way, then you have then the two sides are use military force, do not use military force. There are lots of other ways to frame the conversation about the protests. But Wesley Lowery tweeted, they have to stop with this objective to both sides. I can't remember what he called it. And it's time for moral clarity. And so there's been a lot of pushback to that, because I think that, and from sort of the liberal conservative wing especially, right? Not the really right-wing conservatives, but people like Andrew Sullivan wrote a very long piece, and there have been a number of other less articulate pieces, sort of pushing back against this idea of moral clarity. And I think that moral clarity is always inevitably a challenge to things that we have come to expect that we shouldn't have come to expect. Right? Moral clarity is, or moral aspiration, as I talk about it in the book, is always an invitation or a demand to imagine a better world. But a better world is a different world. It's not the one we live in. And so the debate that we're witnessing now about, around moral clarity is really about the limits of the imagination. And people who feel comfortable living in the current state, even if they don't like Trump, but basically feel comfortable in this country as it is constituted, in this country as it was constituted before Trump came along and that made Trump possible, are extremely uncomfortable with the idea that actually it is necessary to imagine an entirely different political future for this country, which is, I think, what Wesley meant by moral clarity in a way, and certainly what the politics personified by AOC are. So that's a challenge. These ideas are revolutionary, and Trump, of course, he perceives the danger of those ideas because he knows, I think, instinctively that that's how he can be brought down. He could not be brought down by the dominant technocratic wing of the Democratic Party. No amount of arguing that a good resume is better than Donald Trump is ever going to carry the day. What could carry the day is a vision of a glorious future that can actually counterweight his vision of an imaginary past.
Well, we have to recharge our imaginations at that point, right? A lot of people have been searching for this moral clarity or trying to find it, but feel like it's been stymied, or the path toward their imagination has been so blotted out by this numbingness they feel every day that in political discourse we don't have much imagination anymore, except from a few voices.
Right, and that's the real tragedy of a time like this. Autocrats, and this is something that is not specific to Trump, but aspiring autocrats create this kind of state of high anxiety. Right? And he does it masterfully. He does it through so many different means, but just the amount of news that he produces, and contradictory news, and scary news, and outrageous news. I mean, we're all living in what some psychologists call, a state of low-level dread. It's like we're able to function most of the time. We're kind of able to do our jobs, but the work of thinking about a future, planning for our own future, and planning for the future of this country, that's just too challenging for an anxious population. So it's really, really hard, but that's our way out.
Well, one of the people who did imagine one, and you quote him eloquently in the book, was Langston Hughes, when he writes about let America be America again. Oh yes, I say it plain, America was never America to me, and yet I swear by this oath, America will be. That's a profound statement of hope given from one who experienced anything but much of his life.
It's really one of my favorite poems, and there's so much in that poem which kind of ends the book, with permission from the estate from Langston Hughes, because it encompasses this idea that there was something really beautiful to the way this country was conceived. And it doesn't contradict what we're coming to, the understanding that we're increasingly coming to as a country, right? That understanding that we should have had all along, that there's a fatal flaw in the way this country was constructed. And it's a fundamental tragedy that and a structural tragedy that we need to address. And yet there was something incredibly beautiful about the way it was conceived. And those two things are true at the same time. And we can try to hold on to one while taking apart the other. And then maybe we will end up in that glorious future that they envisioned, that he envisioned, and that some of the people who are in the streets right now envision.
Well, that's how you end the book. You end the book with a question: will we commit ourselves to reinvention? And that's exactly the reinvention you're talking about, correct?
Correct, yes.
I'll take some audience questions that came in. The first one is from Ditani, and she asks, can the Russian autocracy ever be overcome and democracy established in Russia?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer and the only correct answer is I don't know. But I just want to challenge the assumption that underlies that question, which is that we can know that some countries are just not suited for democracy, and others are. And I have two problems with that. One is that, countries that we think of as democracies, by and large, were not democracies before they became democracies. And so there's a little bit of a kind of national character idea there that I find not to my liking. And the other is that the question assumes that we know what democracy is. And I don't think we do. Democracy is a dream. Democracy is the idea of a government of the governed. I think it's a mistake to think that we have seen democracy, right? We have seen countries, and I think this country was this for much of its history, that are over time becoming more democratic. And that's really what we have to hope for, right? Democracy is a vector. It's a way of moving toward the dream and expanding the dream. It's never a thing that you accomplish, put in stone and then inhabit. That, I think, is one of our greatest mistakes, is that's how we think about American institutions, is that we came up with this democracy, built it and moved in, and now we're living in it, and we just want Trump to leave us alone so that we can live in it some more. That's not how democracy works. This country has never had, it's worked, but it's also like, it's an ideal that it cannot actually be achieved. It's always in the future. We're never going to have fully a government of all the governed. We can only continuously move in that direction.
The second question is from Aurora, and she asks, do you think the protest and the way they are being portrayed in the media will improve or hurt Trump's chances of winning re-election?
I don't think we know enough about people who are at this event, who I assume read the LA Times or something similar. I don't think we fully grasp the experience of living in the Trumpian media universe. I don't catch glimpses of it very often, but when I do, it's terrifying. Like yesterday, I got a text from this lovely, lovely woman who I rented a house from on Cape Cod for a couple of months. And she said, I hope that protesters haven't damaged your neighborhood. And of course, protesters are me. Protesters are my daughter, who's been out there in the street since literally day one, right? But she, in her little suburban house, is seeing all this footage of robberies and looting and destruction, and she imagines it as something terrifying that needs to be quelled, and that is a threat to good people. Right? She likes me and she wants me to be safe, and that's why she texted that. So that's scary. I don't know how much we can do about that, and I think that the biggest damage has certainly being done not in my media universe, which is what a majority of people in this country live in, but possibly not a large enough majority.
The next question is from Anne. Is it possible for any individual United States citizen to transform herself to resist the lure of autocracy?
That's an interesting question. So it assumes
I don't know if it's a vaccine or
Well, it kind of sounds like the person really feels the seductive lure of autocracy, but is asking, how do I get treatment? I don't really think that that's exactly how it works. But I think if I can interpret the question a little bit more broadly, how do we resist? I mean, it's never been easier. There are protests all over the country, right? And I think it is really essential that these protests continue. They need fresh blood, and they need, you don't necessarily have to be out in the street if there are whatever issues are stopping you from being in the street. But there are so many different ways at this point to support this moment and to make sure it lasts and takes us through to November. Right? And even more broadly, the basic prescription for resisting is to act with others. There's no other prescription. There's no specific thing that you need to necessarily be doing with others. But it's definitely acting with others and doing it offline. Offline.
In the streets, right?
Well, it doesn't have to be in the streets. I mean, maybe it's like ordering pizza and delivering it to the protesters. It's not exactly in the streets, right? But it has to be offline.
What do you think, along those questions, let me ask another observation. What about our society is so online? How do we get offline at the pivotal moments? It seems like we're offline now, but it's interesting because society is headed in another direction. At least how we communicate, how we work, how we do things.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question to consider in the middle of a pandemic, or at the beginning of a pandemic, or wherever it is we are. Obviously, this is, we're online right now, Jeffrey. We are, my entire book tour is online. So it's a funny thing for me to talk about. And obviously it's great. It's amazing that we have this technology, which is an amplifier and an accelerator. But it's an amplifier and accelerator of things that exist offline. I don't think you can have politics per se online. You can have them amplified, you can have them accelerated, but and maybe I lack the imagination for politics online. But I think that for politics to happen, you have to have people working across differences and reaching agreements or landing on ideas across differences. That's what a polis is, right? A polis is people of difference. And I don't think that we're motivated online to build connections and to build ideas across difference. Because when you're stuck in a room with somebody, you really are motivated to find a way to talk to that person. When you're in an online forum with somebody, your biggest motivation is to make the loudest statement possible and slam the door. Right? And I think those, the sort of the animating forces of discussion are the exact opposite, online and offline. And I think that the online animating force is fundamentally anti-political.
Next question from Michelle. Returning to what now feels like ancient history, why has Donald Trump acquiesced to Putin on so many occasions and hid the content of his conversations with him?
Look, I don't like this line of questioning because I see a subtext in it, and maybe I'm wrong, so forgive me. But I think the subtext is that there's a secret, right? There's like something we don't know, and if we could only figure it out, what Russia has on Trump or whatever, then we would have the secret of the Trump presidency. The Trump presidency does not need secrets to explain it. It's all out there in plain view. Right? Out in plain view, this man declared his intention to destroy government as we know it and has been very successfully doing it for 3.5 years. Out in plain view, this man declared his intention to use political power to make more money, to use the money to accumulate more political power, and has been doing it very successfully for 3.5 years. It is all out there. We don't need additional information to understand Trump's motivation or to appraise his actions, right? And that there's a wonderful Bulgarian thinker named Ivan Krastev who talks about the difference between secrets and truth. Right? Secrets is something that has to be revealed, and truth is something that can be known. So I would really like to deal with things that are knowable, and in particular, things that we are observing and we can discuss as we know them. Now, to answer your question more substantively, now that I've taken down the intent, I don't know. He seems to like other autocrats. He seems to want to give them what they want. He acquiesces to them, and sometimes even, as I mentioned with Netanyahu, he gives them more than they asked for. I'm not surprised.
And final question from Hilda. What are some strategies and or tactics that we can use to help educate others about what is an autocracy and the dangers of living in an autocratic society?
Well, I think you should buy lots of copies of my book and give it to all your friends.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time and spending time with us. And hey, one quick question before we go: what's it like doing a book tour online?
Well, you know, the best part of a book tour is having a hotel room to yourself, and that is completely gone. I'm not. My children are no longer as young as they used to be, but my heart really goes out to friends who have small kids who had books drop during this period, and that incredible reward that you get when it's just you and readers and the magic of a hotel room. You don't get that. It's definitely better than nothing. It's interesting to have conversations, but you know, I mean, writing is such a lonely occupation. And then once every few years, you actually go and talk to people who maybe have read a part of your book, and that's amazing. For me, it's part of what motivates me to keep going. So it's actually really sad not to be able to see anybody.
Yeah, have you had any terrible internet connections or things where you've had to, just in the logistics of doing things like this, that have been disconcerting?
Yes, I had Zoom just decide to completely give out on me during my last event, the one that was in San Francisco, and so I was doing it, like, it refused to work on my laptop. I was doing it on my phone, and then it turned out that if a call comes in while you're on Zoom, you will automatically be muted. And then I was trying to tell somebody into the phone that I can't talk, and then I froze in that extremely unattractive pose of being extremely close to the very close to the camera, and like very emphatically saying, I can't talk. So it was just awful.
Well, I wish you good experiences in your magic hotel room in the future. Thanks for sharing time with us. And
thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.